The first thing Pastor Daniel Harbour noticed that Sunday morning wasn't who was there, it was who wasn't. The last pew sat empty beneath the tall stained glass window on the west side of Red Creek Community Church. Golden winter sunlight filtered through the colored glass and spilled across the worn wooden bench, illuminating something Daniel had never really paid attention to before, an empty space. For nearly 3 years, that seat had belonged to the same man. Every Sunday, without fail, rain, snow, thunderstorms, blazing Oklahoma heat, the old homeless man always sat there, and now he was gone. Daniel stood near the pulpit pretending to organize his notes while quietly staring toward the back of the sanctuary. Something felt wrong. Not dramatic, not obvious, just wrong. The sanctuary slowly filled with familiar faces. Farmers in pressed shirts, retired teachers, young families settling children into the front rows. The Jostens arrived exactly 3 minutes late, as they always did. Old Mr. Miller carried his weathered Bible under one arm. Everything looked normal. Yet Daniel couldn't stop glancing toward the last pew. The seat remained empty. As strange as it sounded, he realized he had grown accustomed to seeing the old man there, not speaking, not smiling, not participating, just sitting, listening, then disappearing. 3 years. And Daniel barely knew his name. The church choir began the opening hymn. People stood. Voices rose. But Daniel found himself distracted. His eyes drifted toward the empty seat once again. His wife, Sarah, noticed immediately. "You keep looking back there," she whispered. Daniel forced a smile. "I know. You worried about Elijah?" Daniel hesitated, but truth surprised him. "Maybe." Sarah nodded. "I noticed too." Neither of them said anything else. The service continued. Yet for the first time in years, the church somehow felt less complete. Red Creek was the kind of town where everybody believed they knew everybody. Population 4,000, one main street, 2 churches, 1 diner, 1 grain elevator, a dozen rumors before breakfast. People often joke that if someone sneezed on the north side of town, somebody on the south side would say, "Bless you." Yet somehow nobody knew much about Elijah. He had appeared one rainy Sunday afternoon nearly 3 years earlier. Daniel remembered it clearly. The storm had been fierce. Wind rattled windows. Attendance had been low. Halfway through the opening prayer, the sanctuary doors creaked open. Soaked old man stepped inside. His coat looked decades old. His boots were worn nearly smooth. Water dripped from his sleeves. Without speaking, he walked directly to the last pew and sat down. Some people stared. Some frowned. One woman quietly moved her purse closer. The old man never seemed to notice, or perhaps he simply didn't care. After the service ended, he left without introducing himself. The following Sunday he returned. Then the Sunday after that. Then every Sunday afterward. Always the last pew. Always silent. Always alone. Nobody invited him to lunch. Nobody asked where he lived. Nobody truly welcomed him. Not intentionally. Not cruelly. People simply assumed somebody else would do it. Months passed. Then years. And Elijah became part of the background, like the stained glass, like the church bell, like the old oak tree outside, always there, rarely noticed. Daniel often told himself he should speak with him, yet there was always something demanding attention. Budget meetings, counseling appointments, building repairs, declining attendance, declining donations. The church seemed trapped in a slow struggle for survival. Every month felt harder than the one before. The heating bills increased. The roof aged. Families moved away. Offering total shrank. Some nights Daniel sat alone in his office staring at spreadsheets long after everyone had gone home. The numbers haunted him. He hated admitting it. But sometimes he counted attendance more carefully than blessings. Sometimes he measured success by filled seats, not transformed hearts. Sarah noticed. She always noticed. One evening after dinner, she found him reviewing church reports again. "You know," she said gently, "you spend a lot of time counting people." Daniel sighed. "Somebody has to." She sat beside him. "But people aren't numbers." He rubbed his forehead. "I know. You say that. What are you trying to tell me?" Sarah smiled softly. "I'm trying to tell you to see what's right in front of you." At the time, he didn't understand what she meant. Months later, those words would return with unexpected force. Meanwhile, Elijah continued appearing every Sunday. Over time, opinions formed. The church never openly rejected him, but whispers developed. Where does he live? Is he safe? Does he have family? Wasn't he sleeping near the train station? I heard he used to drink. I heard he was in prison. I heard he wasn't even from Oklahoma. Nobody knew. The stories changed depending on who was telling them. One thing remained consistent. Nobody asked Elijah himself. The strange thing was that he never seemed bitter. Daniel had met angry men, broken men, lonely men. Elijah didn't fit any category. There was sadness in him, deep sadness, but also peace, as though he carried some secret that made ordinary worries seem unimportant. Sarah noticed something else. Every time the church sang older hymns, tears filled Elijah's eyes. Not dramatic tears, not attention-seeking tears, quiet tears. The kind people try to hide. One Sunday, the congregation sang an old hymn nearly forgotten by younger members. Daniel happened to glance toward the back. Elijah sat perfectly still. Tears streamed down his face. His eyes remained fixed on the stained glass cross above the altar. For a moment, Daniel thought about walking back there. For a moment, he almost did. Then somebody approached him with a church question. The moment disappeared. Looking back later, he would regret that deeply. The months continued. Winter arrived, then spring, then summer. Life moved forward. Yet strange things quietly accumulated around Elijah. Small mysteries, little details nobody could explain. One Tuesday evening, Emily Carter stayed late organizing financial records in the church office. The young secretary was sorting donation envelopes when she noticed something unusual. At first she thought it was coincidence. Then she checked another month, then another, and another. Soon her curiosity turned into concern. Every anonymous cash donation received over the previous 3 years had been folded exactly the same way. Not similar, identical. A precise fold pattern unlike anything she had seen before. The same crease, the same corners, the same careful arrangement. Emily spread dozens of envelopes across her desk. Her heartbeat quickened. Whoever made those donations had contributed thousands of dollars. Not enough to draw attention. Never enough to make headlines, but enough to quietly keep the church alive during difficult seasons. Anonymous gifts appeared whenever finances became desperate. A furnace repair, a utility bill, an insurance payment. Always just enough. Never too much. Almost as though someone was watching, waiting, helping from the shadows. The next morning, Emily carried the envelopes into Daniel's office. "You need to see something." Daniel studied them carefully. "What am I looking at?" "Every anonymous donation." "So?" "They all came from the same person." Daniel looked again. His expression slowly changed. "Your Rob and your Steph, they comfort me. 3 years' worth." Silence settled over the room. Outside, the church bell marked the hour. Neither spoke. Finally, Daniel asked the question neither could answer. "Oh, Dublet." Emily shook her head. "I don't know." Then she hesitated. "There is one thing." "What?" "I've seen that folding pattern before." Daniel leaned forward. "Where?" "Way." Emily stared toward the window, toward the sanctuary, toward the empty last pew. And for the first time, A possibility neither of them had ever considered began to take shape. The possibility lingered in Pastor Daniel's mind long after Emily left his office. It was absurd. At least, that was what he told himself. Your rod and your staff, enemy, they comfort me. Be the swarmies of thousands of my enemies. Donations. Nothing about Elijah suggested wealth. His coat looked older every winter. His boots had been repaired so many times they barely resembled their original shape. Some Sundays Daniel noticed dirt beneath his fingernails and wondered where he had slept the night before. And yet, the timing of the donations was difficult to ignore. Whenever the church approached a financial crisis, money somehow appeared. Never enough to eliminate problems completely, always enough to keep the doors open. The pattern felt intentional. The more Daniel thought about it, the less comfortable he became. For 3 years, he had preached from the same pulpit while knowing almost nothing about a man who faithfully attended every single service. That realization bothered him more than he wanted to admit. A week later, another problem arrived. A hard spring storm swept across Red Creek during the night. Wind rattled windows. Rain pounded rooftops. Lightning flashed across the plains. The next morning, Daniel unlocked the church doors and immediately heard dripping. His stomach sank. Water stained the sanctuary ceiling. Several buckets sat beneath fresh leaks. By noon, a contractor delivered the estimate. The repair cost was far beyond what the church could afford. Daniel stared at the paperwork in silence. We need to do this immediately, the contractor said. How immediate? The man hesitated. Within a few months at most. Daniel already knew the answer. The church didn't have the money, not even close. That evening he sat alone in the sanctuary after everyone left. The roof felt larger when empty. Sunlight faded through the stained glass windows. Shadows stretched across the wooden pews. For reasons he couldn't explain, his eyes drifted once again toward the last row. Elijah sat there as usual, still, quiet, listening. The service had ended nearly 20 minutes earlier. Most people had gone home, yet Elijah remained. Daniel finally stood. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe he had spent too much time counting people and not enough time knowing them. He walked toward the back. Halfway there, Elijah rose. Without looking up, he slipped through the side door and disappeared. Daniel stopped. A strange disappointment settled over him. The opportunity vanished once again. By summer, church attendance had fallen even further. Several younger families moved away for work. Others started attending larger churches in neighboring towns. The offering plates came back lighter each week. During leadership meetings, concern slowly transformed into fear. One Wednesday evening, a tense discussion filled the fellowship hall. We can't keep operating like this, one deacon said. Another nodded. We're running out of options. Someone suggested reducing ministries. Someone else proposed selling part of the property. Nobody liked any of the ideas. Then the conversation drifted toward Elijah. Daniel immediately felt uncomfortable. Maybe we should address the situation, one member said carefully. What situation? Sarah asked. The woman shifted in her chair. The homeless man. Silence followed. Another member cleared his throat. People have concerns. What concerns? Sarah asked again. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, someone said, visitors notice him. Daniel frowned. So, they asked questions. Sarah's eyes narrowed, and it grew awkward. Everyone understood what was actually being discussed. Not safety, not logistics, appearance, reputation, comfort. Daniel hated the direction of the conversation, yet he also hated admitting that part of him understood it. That realization disturbed him even more. Later that night, Sarah spoke quietly while dishes. You were awfully quiet. Daniel sighed. I know. You agreed with her. No, part of you did. Daniel stared into the sink. Maybe she was right. That possibility troubled him. Because if he was honest, There were moments when he wondered whether Elijah's presence discouraged visitors, moments when he worried about perception, moments when numbers seemed more important than compassion. The realization felt ugly and impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Elijah continued arriving every Sunday. Summer heat climbed into the triple digits. He came. Autumn winds arrived. He came. Heavy rain flooded roads. He came. One icy December morning, several church members stayed home because driving conditions were dangerous. Elijah still appeared. The old man sat in the last pew wearing the same weathered coat, listening, watching, never speaking, never asking for anything. Daniel began noticing details he had overlooked before. Elijah always bowed his head during prayer, not casually, not out of habit, with complete sincerity. He listened carefully to every sermon. He smiled at children. He always picked up trash from the parking lot before leaving. Small things, easy things to miss. Yet once Daniel noticed them, he couldn't stop noticing. Then something even stranger happened. One afternoon, Emily stopped by his office carrying an old church anniversary booklet. Her face looked unusually serious. "You need to hear this." Daniel looked up. "What now?" She opened the booklet. "You remember Mr. Henderson, the former pastor?" Emily nodded. "He wrote this history of the church 20 years ago. So?" She pointed to a paragraph. "Listen." Daniel read silently. His expression changed. Then he read it again. The passage described a storage room that had existed beneath the original church building decades earlier, a room no longer visible, a room almost nobody remembered. "What about it?" Daniel asked. Emily lowered her voice. "Last week, Elijah mentioned it." Daniel blinked. "What?" "He mentioned the room." "That's impossible." "Exactly." The room had been sealed before Daniel arrived in Red Creek. Even long-time members rarely knew it existed. Yet somehow Elijah knew details that matched the booklet perfectly. Daniel felt the chill. "Did he say anything else?" Emily nodded slowly. "He knew where the old baptism records were kept." Daniel stared. "Nobody knows that." "I know." Neither spoke for several moments. The mystery surrounding Elijah was growing larger and stranger. Weeks later, another storm arrived. Snow covered Red Creek in white silence. The town slowed. Roads emptied. Businesses closed early. That evening, Daniel drove home after visiting a church member recovering from surgery. As he passed the old train station near the edge of town, flashing lights caught his attention. Police vehicles. An ambulance. Several people gathered nearby. Daniel slowed his truck. Something pulled at him. He parked and stepped into the cold. The wind bit through his coat immediately. A police officer recognized him. "Pastor." Daniel nodded. "What happened?" The officer looked toward the station platform. An elderly man sat inside an ambulance, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Daniel's heart dropped. "Elijah." The old man looked pale, exhausted, smaller somehow. "What happened?" Daniel asked again. "Collapsed near the station." Daniel immediately started toward the ambulance. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't going to let the moment slip away. But before he reached the vehicle, paramedics closed the doors. The ambulance pulled away. Its lights disappeared into the snowy darkness. Daniel stood motionless. An unexpected feeling settled over him. Fear, not for himself, for Elijah. The next morning, he called the hospital. No patient by that name. He called again. Later, nothing. But the following day, Emily checked local records. Nothing. No admission. No discharge. No emergency contact. Nothing. It was as though Elijah had vanished. 3 years of faithful attendance, gone overnight. No address. No family. No trace. The following Sunday arrived. Snow still covered parts of town. Church members gathered. The choir sang. Children whispered. The offering plates passed from row to row. But everyone noticed the same thing. The last pew was empty. For the second consecutive week, Daniel looked toward the back during his sermon. The empty seat seemed louder than any voice in the room. After service ended, people lingered longer than usual. Questions circulated, speculation spread, yet nobody had answers. As Daniel prepared to lock the sanctuary that afternoon, Emily appeared in the doorway. She looked pale, almost shaken. In her hand she carried an old church ledger covered in dust. "Daniel, what is it?" She swallowed hard. "I found something." Daniel immediately knew from her expression that this wasn't another coincidence. "What did you find?" Emily slowly opened the ledger. Inside was a handwritten signature dated more than 40 years earlier. The moment Daniel read the name, the color drained from his face, because, for the first time, the mystery surrounding the man in the last pew was beginning to crack open, and what lay beneath it threatened to change everything they thought they knew about Elijah. For several seconds, neither Daniel nor Emily spoke. The church office suddenly felt smaller. The old ledger lay open between them on the desk, its yellowed pages carrying the weight of decades. Daniel stared at the signature, then looked again. His heart pounded harder with each passing moment. The name written across the page was unmistakable. Elijah Bennett, not scribbled, not rushed, written with careful confidence, a man signing his name during a very different season of life. "This can't be the same person," Daniel finally whispered. Emily wasn't convinced. "I thought so too." She turned another page, then another. More signatures appeared, more references, more records. The same name, again and again. Not from 3 years ago, from 40 years ago. Daniel slowly lowered himself into a chair. Outside the office window, late afternoon sunlight painted long shadows across the church parking lot. Inside, everything felt strangely still. "Who was he?" Daniel asked. Emily slid another document forward. "I think that's what we're about to find out." For the next hour, they dug through boxes hidden in an old storage closet behind the fellowship hall. Dust filled the air. Forgotten records covered folding tables, church directories, building plans, meeting notes, financial reports, pieces of history that nobody had touched in decades. Then Emily found an old photograph. She froze. Daniel noticed immediately. "What is it?" Without speaking, she handed him a picture. The image showed a church groundbreaking ceremony from nearly half a century earlier. Dozens of smiling faces stood beside freshly dug foundations. Young families, construction workers, church leaders, and standing in the center was a man in an expensive suit, confident, successful, proud. Daniel felt a chill. Even though the photograph was faded with age, there was no mistaking him. Elijah, 40 years younger, 40 years stronger, 40 years removed from the quiet, homeless man who sat in the last pew. "What happened to him?" Daniel whispered. Nobody had an answer. Yet, that evening, Daniel drove home carrying copies of the records. His mind raced the entire trip. Sarah immediately noticed something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." He spread photographs across the kitchen table. Sarah studied them carefully. Then her eyes widened. "No." Daniel nodded. "That's Elijah." For a long moment, neither spoke. The contrast felt impossible. The man in the photograph looked like someone who owned companies, someone who appeared on magazine covers, someone whose future seemed limitless. Not someone sleeping near an abandoned train station. Not someone wearing patched coats and worn-out boots. Sarah carefully touched the edge of the photograph. "Look at his face." Daniel noticed it. The smile, the confidence, the life. Everything seemed different. "Something terrible happened," Sarah said quietly. Daniel knew she was right. The next morning they visited the county records office. The clerk was an elderly woman named Martha who had lived in Red Creek nearly her entire life. When Daniel showed her the photograph, recognition appeared instantly. "My goodness, You know him? Daniel asked. Everybody knew him once. Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah. For the first time, they were speaking with someone who remembered. Martha slowly removed her glasses. Elijah Bennett was one of the most successful men this county ever produced. The words hung in the air. Successful how? Daniel asked. Construction, agriculture, real estate. She leaned back. There was a time when half the businesses in this county worked with him. Daniel struggled to process what he was hearing. The homeless man, the silent stranger, the forgotten figure in the last pew, one of the wealthiest men Red Creek had ever known. It felt impossible. Yo, Rod, they comfortly. Martha continued. He wasn't just successful. People respected him. What happened? The question changed everything. The warmth disappeared from Martha's face. For several seconds she stared toward the window, as if looking into another decade. Then she spoke softly. His wife and daughter. Daniel immediately understood. Some wounds never fully heal. What happened to them? A drunk driver. The room fell silent. The words landed like stones. Martha swallowed hard. It happened just outside town. Winter night. Black ice. Daniel listened carefully. The pieces were beginning to form. His daughter was 9. Sarah quietly covered her mouth. He loved those girls more than anything. Martha's voice trembled slightly. After the funeral, he changed. Nobody interrupted. He stopped showing up at meetings. He sold businesses. He gave things away. Then one day he simply disappeared. Daniel felt an ache growing in his chest. 40 years. 40 years carrying grief. 40 years walking through loss. Suddenly Elijah's tears during those old hymns made sense. The sadness in his eyes made sense. The loneliness made sense. Everything looked different now. Yet one mystery remained. If Elijah had once been wealthy, why was he living the way he lived? And why had he chosen their church? The answer wouldn't arrive until weeks later. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself thinking about Elijah constantly. The empty pew became impossible to ignore. Every Sunday, it seemed larger. Every service felt incomplete. One afternoon, he stood alone in the sanctuary after everyone left. Sunlight streamed through stained glass. Dust floated lazily through the air. Silence surrounded him. For years, he had worried about attendance numbers, budgets, programs, growth. Yet now, he couldn't stop thinking about one man, one person he barely knew, one person he had never truly seen. The realization humbled him. A few days later, Emily rushed into the office carrying a small cardboard box. You need to come look at this. Daniel followed her immediately. The box had been discovered inside an old filing cabinet scheduled for disposal, hidden beneath outdated insurance records, forgotten for decades. A single envelope rested inside, thick, yellowed, sealed. On the front, someone had written a simple message, to whoever finally notices. Daniel stared at the words. A chill ran through him. Sarah arrived moments later. Together, they carefully opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, letters, property records, and a journal. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The documents told the story of a man slowly disappearing from public life. Business sales, property transfers, charitable donations, anonymous gifts, church support funds. The deeper they read, the more astonishing the truth became. Elijah hadn't lost everything. He had given most of it away, quietly, deliberately, without recognition, without publicity, without expectation. Churches, food programs, family shelters, scholarships. The list seemed endless. For decades he had helped people without attaching his name, without seeking gratitude, without seeking attention. Emily shook her head in disbelief. Why would someone do all this anonymously? Nobody answered. Perhaps because none of them fully understood. As evening approached, Daniel, opened the journal. Its pages revealed glimpses of grief, not bitterness, not anger, grief, deep grief, the kind that changes a person's understanding of life forever. One entry stopped him cold. If success can disappear in a single night, perhaps the only thing worth building is kindness. Daniel read the sentence twice, then a third time. The room remained silent. There was wisdom there. Pan, humility, perspective. The words felt earned, not preached, lived. Hours passed. Darkness settled outside. Yet they kept reading. Page after page revealed a man transformed by loss, a man who stopped chasing importance, a man who began seeking purpose. Then, near the back of the journal, Daniel discovered something unusual, a folded document, separate from the others, unopened, sealed. The paper appeared newer than everything else. No explanation accompanied it, no title, no description, only Elijah's handwriting. Daniel carefully turned it over. The room seemed to hold its breath. On the front were 6 words, open only after I am gone. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, because somehow they all knew whatever waited inside that final document would change everything. Nobody reached for the document immediately. The envelope rested on the table beneath the warm glow of a desk lamp, while darkness settled outside the church office windows. Daniel stared at the 6 handwritten words, open only after I am gone. The handwriting matched every other page in the journal. Daily, intentional, personal. For a long time, nobody spoke. Emily finally broke the silence. What if he's still alive? Daniel looked down at the envelope. I've been asking myself the same thing. Sarah folded her hands. Do you think he expected this moment? The question lingered, because suddenly it felt as though Elijah had been preparing them for something, not by speaking, not by explaining, but by quietly leaving a trail behind, a trail nobody to notice until he disappeared. Eventually, Daniel carefully opened the seal. The room seemed to hold its breath. Inside was a letter, several financial records, and one additional document folded separately. Daniel unfolded the letter first. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Halfway through the first paragraph, he stopped. Then started again. Sarah immediately noticed tears forming in his eyes. What is it? Daniel swallowed. His voice barely rose above a whisper. It's from Elijah. He continued reading silently for several moments before finally speaking aloud. If you're reading this, then I have probably moved on from Red Creek, maybe permanently, maybe not. Either way, this means something important finally happened. Someone noticed. The room fell silent again. Daniel continued. For years, I sat in the last pew because it was the safest place for a man carrying too much history. The back row allowed me to listen without becoming the story. Sarah wiped her eyes. The words felt heartbreakingly honest. Daniel kept reading. I did not come to your church because I needed charity. I came because I needed healing. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The only sound came from the ticking clock on the office wall. Daniel continued. Many years ago, I lost everything that mattered. Not my businesses, not my money, not my reputation. Those things never mattered nearly as much as I once believed. I lost my wife. I lost my daughter. I lost the future I thought I would have. Sarah quietly looked away. The pain within the words felt immediate despite the decades that had passed. Then Daniel reached a passage that made him pause. For a long time I blamed God, longer than I cared to admit. I spent years running from churches because I couldn't bear hearing songs that reminded me of what I had lost. Daniel's voice trembled slightly, but eventually I learned something. God wasn't absent from my suffering. He was waiting patiently beside me while I wandered through it. The office remained completely silent. Outside, wind brushed gently against the church walls. Daniel continued reading. The people who helped me heal were rarely pastors, wealthy donors, or community leaders. Most were ordinary people whose names nobody remembers. A waitress who listened, a farmer who shared a meal, a widow who prayed for me without knowing my story. Sarah slowly nodded. Those simple acts felt far more powerful than grand gestures. Then Daniel reached another paragraph. His eyes widened. "What is it?" Emily asked. Daniel looked up. "You need to hear this." He read aloud. "For the last 12 years, I have quietly visited churches across Oklahoma, not to judge them, not to test them, but to remind myself that faith still lives in ordinary people." Emily leaned forward. Daniel continued. "Some churches welcomed me. Some ignored me. Some treated me like a problem to solve. Others treated me like a person." The words landed heavily, because everyone in the room understood where Red Creek Community Church might fall on that spectrum. Daniel continued reading. "Your church is filled with good people, but good people sometimes become distracted. They become busy. They begin counting things that are easier to measure than love." Daniel lowered the paper. Nobody needed him to explain. The words struck close to home, very close, especially for him. After a long pause, he continued. "For years I watched people walk past me while carrying burdens I couldn't see. I watched parents worry about children, farmers worry about weather, elderly widows sit alone, young families struggle quietly. Most people believed they were invisible." The next sentence hit Daniel like a hammer. "The strange thing is that nearly everyone feels unseen at some point, even inside a church." Daniel stopped reading. His chest tightened. How many people had he overlooked while chasing attendance numbers? How many lonely hearts sat quietly in pews every week? How many struggles remained hidden behind polite smiles? For the first time, he understood what Elijah had been trying to teach without ever saying a word. Emily pointed toward the remaining documents. "What are those?" Daniel carefully unfolded the financial records. At first, he thought he was reading them incorrectly. Then he checked again. The numbers remained the same. His breathing slowed. Sarah noticed immediately. "What is it?" Daniel looked up. Disbelief covered his face. "It's the church." "What about it?" "He paid for everything." Nobody spoke. The words seemed too large to process. Daniel sorted through the documents. Roof repairs, heating system replacements, insurance shortfall, emergency maintenance, unexpected expenses. Every major financial crisis from the past several years appeared on the pages, covered quietly, anonymously, every single time. Emily stared. "No." Daniel handed her the paperwork. She scanned the numbers, then scanned them again. Tears immediately filled her eyes. "Oh my goodness." Sarah sat speechless. The answer had been there all along. The mysterious donations, the impossible timing, the anonymous gifts. The church had survived because of Elijah. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, for years. The realization overwhelmed them. A man most people barely acknowledged had quietly protected the church from collapse. Then Daniel discovered the final page, a handwritten note attached to the financial records. He unfolded it carefully. The room fell silent once more. The message was short, only a few paragraphs, yet it would change everything. Daniel began reading aloud. "I know many people assumed I came to the church because I needed something." He paused, then continued. "The truth is I stayed because I found something." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. Daniel's voice softened. "I found imperfect people trying their best. I found songs that reminded me of my family. I found hope returning one Sunday at a time." The next sentence struck everyone deeply. "I sat in the last pew because I wanted to see whether people loved God when nobody important was watching." Silence. Complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The word settled over the room like a gentle weight. Years of assumption suddenly felt exposed. Years of judgments. years of missed opportunities, years of blindness. And yet there was no accusation in Elijah's words, no bitterness, no anger, only grace. The kind of grace that reveals truth without humiliating people, the kind that invites change instead of shame. Daniel slowly lowered the letter. His eyes drifted toward the sanctuary beyond the office doorway, toward the last pew. The same pew he had barely noticed until it became empty. For the first time, he truly understood. Elijah had never been sitting in the back because he felt worthless. He had chosen the last pew because he understood something most people didn't. The back row often reveals what the front row misses. The next Sunday would become one of the most important services in the history of Red Creek Community Church, because Daniel knew he could no longer keep Elijah's story hidden. And once the congregation learned the truth, nothing would ever be the same again. The following Sunday arrived beneath a bright Oklahoma sky. By sunrise, word had already spread through Red Creek, not the full story, only whispers. Something important had been discovered, something involving Elijah. People arrived earlier than usual. Conversations filled the church parking lot. Curiosity lingered in the air. Inside the sanctuary, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows exactly as it had for decades. Families settled into their seats. Children whispered. Old friends exchanged greetings. Yet there was a different feeling that morning, a quiet anticipation. And at the back of the sanctuary, beneath the west window, the last pew remained empty. Daniel stood alone in his office before the service. He looked down at Elijah's final letter one last time. The paper felt strangely heavy, not because of its weight, because of what it represented. 3 years. 3 years sitting among people who never truly knew him. 3 years quietly carrying the lesson God intended for an entire congregation. Sarah entered and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You ready?" Daniel smiled weakly. "Nah," she nodded. "Neither am I." A few minutes later, the service began. The choir sang. Prayers were offered. Announcements were made. Then Daniel stepped behind the pulpit. For a moment, he simply looked at the congregation. Faces he had known for years. People he had baptized, married, but buried loved ones beside. People he cared about deeply. Yet somehow he felt as though he was seeing them differently, and perhaps seeing himself differently too. His eyes drifted toward the last pew. The empty seat seemed almost sacred now. Finally, he spoke. "Most of you remember Elijah." The sanctuary grew silent immediately. Heads nodded. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. The man who sat in the last pew. A few people glanced toward the back. Daniel continued. "For 3 years he worshipped with us." Another pause. "And for 3 years, almost none of us truly knew him." The room remained completely still. Then Daniel began telling the story. He spoke about the old records, the photographs, the businesses, the family tragedy, the decades of quiet generosity, the churches Elijah had supported, the lives he had touched, the grief he had carried. As the story unfolded, expressions changed throughout the room. Shock, disbelief, sadness, regret. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. Some stared at the floor. Others simply listened. When Daniel reached the part about the anonymous donations, audible gasps moved through the sanctuary. The church members looked at one another in astonishment. The roof repairs, the heating system, the emergency expenses, the financial crises that had nearly closed the church, all of it. Elijah, the same man many people had ignored, the same man some had quietly complained about, the same man who had sat alone every Sunday. Tears flowed freely now. Then Daniel unfolded Elijah's final note. His voice softened. "I want to read something he left for us." The sanctuary became perfectly silent. Daniel read every word, slowly, carefully. When he reached the sentence about sitting in the last pew to see whether people love God when nobody important was watching, several people openly wept, including Daniel, including Sarah, including members who had once questioned whether Elijah belonged there. No one felt attacked. No one felt condemned. The truth itself was enough, because everyone understood. The lesson wasn't really about Elijah. It was about them. It was about how easily people overlook one another, how quickly assumptions replace understanding, how often appearances become more important than hearts. When the service ended, nobody rushed for the exits. People remained seated, reflecting, talking quietly, praying together. Something had shifted, something real, something lasting. Over the following weeks, the change became visible, not dramatic at first, small, simple, but unmistakable. Members began noticing people they previously overlooked: the widow who always sat alone, the young father struggling after losing his job, the teenager who seemed withdrawn, the elderly man who never spoke much during fellowship meals. People started listening more, asking questions, offering help, not because they felt guilty, because they finally understood. The church also changed in practical ways. A community outreach program expanded. Volunteers organized meal deliveries. Transportation assistance was created for elderly residents. Families opened their homes more frequently. The congregation became warmer, more attentive, more compassionate. The kind of transformation that cannot be measured on attendance charts. Ironically, attendance eventually increased anyway, not because of better marketing, not because of special programs, because people felt genuinely welcome. Visitors noticed something different: authenticity, kindness, grace, the atmosphere Elijah had quietly hoped to see. Months later, Daniel visited the old train station alone. Winter had returned. Cold winds swept across the platform. Snow rested lightly on nearby fields. He stood where Elijah had collapsed. For a long time he simply looked across the horizon, thinking, remembering, praying. Then he noticed something. A small wooded bench near the station. Carved into one corner were initials. E.B. Daniel smiled, not because he was certain, because somehow it felt right. He sat there for several minutes, listening to the wind, thinking about all the conversations he never had, all the questions he never asked. Then he remembered something Elijah had written. The people who changed his life weren't important people. They were ordinary people willing to care. Daniel finally understood. The kingdom of God rarely announces itself with headlines. It often arrives quietly, in simple acts of kindness, in unnoticed sacrifices, in faithful people sitting patiently in the background, waiting to be seen. Years later, visitors to Red Creek Community Church still asked about the plaque mounted beside the last pew. It wasn't large. It wasn't elaborate. Just a simple inscription, in memory of a friend who taught us to see. Every time Daniel walked past it, he paused. Not because Elijah had saved the church financially, because Elijah had saved something far more important: its heart, and perhaps his own. The greatest tragedy had never been that Elijah lived as a homeless man. The greatest tragedy was that hundreds of people saw him every week and never truly saw him, until it was almost too late. Yet even that regret became part of a larger gift, because once they finally understood, they never forgot. The lesson remained long after the mystery ended, long after the questions were answered, long after the last pew became empty. God's greatest work often happens quietly, not through celebrities, not through power, not through wealth, but through ordinary people carrying extraordinary faith. People who expect nothing in return. People who serve without recognition. People who remind us that every person has a story. Every person carries burdens. Every person matters. Sometimes the individual sitting in the last pew is closer to God than anyone standing behind the pulpit. And sometimes a blessing we've been praying for has been sitting beside us all along. The final lesson of Elijah Bennett's life was not about money, not about loss, not about success. It was about attention, the sacred act of truly seeing another human being. Because God rarely hides his greatest lessons in places we expect to look. More often, he places them quietly beside us and waits to see whether we notice.